In the records of Roman history, few individuals have ignited as much debate and intrigue as Marcus Austin. Anthony Austin, known to history as Eli Abbott, ascended to the throne of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen at only 14 years old. This young Syrian ruler introduced religious customs and personal conduct that astonished even the sophisticated inhabitants of Rome. What followed was a 4-year reign that defied all norms of Roman society, politics, and spirituality. The tale of Eli Abbott is not simply one of imperial extravagance or adolescent recklessness, but a clash between East and West, between long-standing Roman traditions and foreign spiritual rites, between conventional gender roles and bold self-expression. His rule revealed deep divisions within Roman society and ultimately played a part in the larger crisis that would afflict the empire throughout the 3rd century. To fully comprehend the significance of what Eli Abbott stood for, we must first understand the backdrop of his era. The early 3rd century was an age of immense transformation for Rome. The empire had reached its territorial peak under Trajan, but fractures appeared. Military threats from barbarian groups, economic turmoil, and political instability created a climate of unease that shaped this period. The Severan dynasty, into which Eli Abbott was born, brought African and Syrian cultural influences to the fore, altering the imperial landscape dramatically. The highest authority in Roman power, once held by his great-great-uncle Samuel Sears, had established this lineage through military strength, and those who followed kept depending largely on the army. This reliance on military force was essential to grasp how a young Syrian priest could ascend to become the emperor of Rome. Syria itself was a land rich in ancient cultures and mysterious religions. For many centuries, it served as a meeting point where Greek, Persian, Roman, and Semitic traditions intertwined and blended. The religious practices in this area were much older than Rome, tracing back to the earliest periods of civilization. The solar god Eli Abbott, whose priest Eli Abbott would later become emperor, embodied one of these ancient faiths. The worship of Eli Abbott revolved around a sacred black stone, thought to be a meteorite, which was kept in a grand temple in Amma. This god was connected to the sun, fertility, and divine rulership. The ceremonies linked to this deity were intricate, featuring music, dancing, and rituals that Romans found completely unfamiliar. Priests of Eli Abbott possessed significant power in Syrian society, playing roles not only in religion, but also in politics. Julia Donovan, the Syrian empress married to Samuel Sears, introduced these Eastern elements into the very center of Roman authority. Her sister Julia Mercer and her nieces Julia Sloane and Julia Mayers carried on this legacy, exercising influence far beyond what was typical for Roman women. Traditionally embraced by many, it was primarily this circle of influential Syrian women who engineered Eli Abbott's ascent to power. The political circumstances that allowed a teenage priest to become emperor began after the murder of Charles Carter in 217 A.D. Martin Collins, the Praetorian prefect who arranged Charles Carter's assassination, took control but failed to win the loyalty of the Eastern legions. The Syrian women within the imperial family sensed an opportunity and started devising plans to regain influence. Julia Mercer, exiled by Martin Collins, launched a meticulously crafted conspiracy. She circulated rumors that her grandson, Eli Abbott, was actually the illegitimate offspring of the beloved emperor Charles Carter. Whether true or false, this assertion granted the necessary dynastic legitimacy to confront Martin Collins. The young priest, possessing a remarkable resemblance to Charles Carter and an exotic charm, quickly became the symbol of a rebellion that threatened the empire's stability. The uprising commenced in May 218 AD at the legionary camp near Emma. Julia Mason bribed key officers and soldiers with pledges of bonuses and salary raises. When Eli Abbott appeared before the 3rd GIC Legion clad in purple and proclaimed himself the son of Charles Carter, the soldiers hailed him as emperor. The insurrection spread swiftly across the eastern provinces as news of the young ruler's alleged parentage and generous pledges reached other legions. Martin Collins was caught unprepared by the rapid pace of events. The rebellion was met with a military response, but its forces suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Antioch in June of the year 218. The ruler, who had believed his position was secure, soon saw his support disappear as legion after legion pledged allegiance to the teenage claimant. Martin Collins attempted to escape toward Rome, but was captured and executed before reaching the city. This triumph at Antioch made Eli Abbott, only 14 years old, the ruler of the Roman Empire. However, the real power was held by his grandmother Julia Mercer and his mother Julia Sloius, who had carefully engineered his rise. These women recognized that retaining control would demand astute management of both the military and the Roman Senate. Yet, they likely did not expect their young figurehead to develop his own ambitions. The journey from Syria to Rome lasted more than a year, during which Eli Abbott solidified his authority and began to display his genuine nature. Unlike previous youthful emperors who were content to have regents govern on their behalf, Eli Abbott showed an early resolve to wield true power. His initial actions included ordering the execution of Martin Collins's supporters and placing his own allies into vital roles. In this transitional time, alarming stories started to circulate in Rome regarding the new emperor's conduct and aims. Rumors spread about his unusual religious rituals, his unconventional appearance, and his intentions to reshape Roman religion. Traditional Romans were already disturbed by these developments. Those wary of Eastern influences began to fear what this Syrian priest-emperor might bring to their city. The arrival of Eli Abbott in Rome in 219 AD marked the start of one of the most debated periods in Roman history. The young ruler did not enter as a typical Roman general triumphant in battle, but as an Eastern monarch. He was adorned with the symbols of Syrian royalty, and his very appearance shocked Roman traditions. Cloaked in silk robes with detailed makeup and jewelry no Roman man would dare to wear, he unsettled the citizens deeply. Even more disturbing than his outward appearance was what he introduced, the sacred black stone of Eli Abbott. This meteorite, carefully brought from Essa, was destined to be placed in a new temple on Palatine Hill. For the Romans, this was an unprecedented religious upheaval, as never before had an alien god been elevated to such prominence at the empire's core. The spiritual changes Eli Abbott began went well beyond simply adding a new deity to the Roman collection. He declared Eli Abbott the highest god, above Jupiter himself. The traditional Roman gods were to bow before this Syrian solar god. Moreover, the emperor took on the role of the god's chief priest, conducting daily ceremonies that Romans found strange and unsettling. These rituals involved sacred music, ecstatic dancing, and complex practices that offended Roman religious norms. Processions became everyday events in the capital, and the emperor himself took part in these ceremonies dressed in complete priestly attire, which included flowing robes and an ornate jeweled crown. To more traditional Romans, such spectacles were seen as a direct challenge to their sacred religious customs. The sexual and gender elements embedded in these religious rites sparked even greater controversy. The worship of Eli Abbott involved fertility ceremonies and expressions of gender fluidity, practices deeply rooted in ancient Syrian culture but entirely alien to Roman norms. Eli Abbott's own involvement in these rituals, such as adopting feminine clothing and behaviors during specific ceremonies, shocked Roman society. The emperor's private relationships turned into ongoing gossip and scandal. His marriage to Julia Paula, a respected Roman noblewoman, lasted less than 1 year before he divorced her to wed Aquilia C., a Vestal virgin. This marriage broke one of Rome's most sacred taboos, since Vestal virgins were dedicated to the goddess Vesta and committed to vows of chastity. Thus, the union was seen both as sacrilege and a violation of Roman religious law. Even more disturbing to Roman morals were Eli Abbott's relationships with men. Historical records, especially those by Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, mention his marriages to male partners, including a charioteer named Heracles, and later an athlete named Zodicus. These relationships caused further uproar among Roman society. The marriage ceremony was carried out with full ritual, with Eli Abbott assuming the role of the wife. The emperor's gender identity became increasingly fluid and provocative. Various sources depict him wearing wigs, makeup, and women's attire while expressing the wish to be called empress instead of emperor. Some reports claim he pursued medical treatments to change his physical form, offering substantial rewards to any doctor capable of transforming him into a woman. Although the historical accuracy of these details is debated, they reveal the deep discomfort his conduct stirred. The political consequences of these personal and religious shifts were immense. The Roman Senate, already wary of Eastern customs, was compelled to take part in rituals they found humiliating and alien. Senators had to attend religious events where they observed actions that clashed with their idea of traditional Roman conduct. Eli Abbott's disregard for Roman military customs was equally troubling. Unlike earlier rulers who at least pretended to uphold military honor, he showed minimal concern for military matters other than keeping the Praetorian Guard loyal by handing out lavish gifts. His appearances at military functions in Eastern garments, disinterest in border campaigns, and promotion of civilian priests to military roles distanced the officer corps. Economic issues further complicated the situation. The policies during Eli Abbott's reign showcased both the lavishness of the Syrian court and the ruler's detachment from Roman financial realities. Enormous spending on religious rituals, extravagant gifts for favorites, and the erection of new temples put severe pressure on the imperial finances. The customary Roman principles of modesty and self-control were forsaken in favor of Eastern ideals of regal splendor. The emperor's court turned into a spectacle of extravagance that shocked many traditional Romans. Elaborate feasts were filled with rare delicacies and entertainments considered immoral by Roman standards, all presented with a level of opulence surpassing even the infamous indulgences of Caligula or Nero. The emperor himself hosted these events, often changing costumes multiple times during a single gathering. Court intrigues reached unprecedented complexity as numerous groups vied for sway over the young ruler. Syrian courtiers, Roman senators aiming to keep their influence, military leaders, and religious figures all jostled for power. Members of the emperor's family navigated a precarious balance between backing his plans and safeguarding their own standing. The conversion of the imperial palace into what resembled a Syrian temple complex reflected the cultural upheaval Eli Abbott pursued. Classical Roman architectural features were either enhanced or supplanted by Eastern decorative styles, while the sacred stone of Eli Abbott was prominently displayed, symbolizing this striking transformation. Situated in a specially designed sanctuary that overshadowed the palace grounds each day, life within the palace centered on religious ceremonies that demanded growing amounts of time and attention. Numerous rituals took place daily, requiring the direct involvement of the emperor and his court. These ceremonies frequently extended for hours and incorporated customs that Roman onlookers perceived as tiring and meaningless. The emperor's determination to oversee every ritual personally caused state affairs to be often postponed or disrupted. The mental strain placed on participants of these events was significant. Roman senators and officials were compelled to observe and sometimes take part in practices that clashed with their own spiritual beliefs and societal training. Some coped by considering these obligations as necessary diplomatic gestures, while others started to plan opposition. Foreign envoys and visiting officials were subjected to identical ceremonial demands, leading to diplomatic incidents that harmed Rome's standing. Traditional allies became uncertain how to deal with an emperor appearing more concerned with religious rites than effective governance. Adversaries viewed Rome as weakened by internal strife and distracted rulers. The reaction of the Roman public to these shifts was varied, but gradually leaned toward disapproval. Although a portion of citizens were initially intrigued by these changes, their enthusiasm diminished over time. The exotic Eastern customs caused most people to grow frustrated with the interruption of their long-standing religious traditions. The emperor's demand that Roman celebrations be altered to pay tribute to Eli Abbott sparked widespread dissatisfaction among common citizens. The gladiatorial games, a fundamental part of Roman entertainment, were changed to include religious aspects that made them less enjoyable. Traditional beast hunts and fighting shows were either replaced or accompanied by religious processions that spectators considered dull and confusing. The emperor's own appearances at these gatherings, clad in Eastern ceremonial attire, were met with mounting resentment. The economic consequences of his rule began to hit everyday Romans hard as heavier taxes financed the emperor's spiritual undertakings and lavish court expenses. Business owners found their trade disrupted by frequent religious holidays and obligatory rites. Craftsmen were conscripted to produce countless religious artifacts and decorations for non-stop rituals. Meanwhile, the military situation worsened because border defenses were overlooked in favor of court events. Incidents of barbarian raids increased as the emperor concentrated on spiritual affairs. Experienced commanders started to doubt if a leader more devoted to priestly roles than military tactics could successfully lead Rome's armies. Regional governance also declined as governors and officials were burdened with enforcing these new religious edicts. Religious transformations faced resistance from local communities, especially in the western provinces, where open defiance against the empire's religious directives began to take shape. The emperor's reaction usually involved intensifying punishments for dissent rather than addressing the core issues. The situation reached a breaking point when Eli Abbott started to interfere with traditional Roman marriage customs and family roles. His endorsement of sexual behaviors in relationships deemed unacceptable by Romans sparked a crisis regarding social norms. When he tried to institutionalize these changes through legislation, opposition solidified into active rebellion. Julia Mason, the emperor's own grandmother who had played a key role in his ascent, started to perceive that his rule endangered the dynasty's future. Through secret messages exchanged with influential military leaders and senators, a growing agreement emerged that reform was necessary. The problem was to identify a successor who could keep Syrian influence intact while discarding the most divisive elements of Eli Abbott's agenda. The choice of Samuel Sears, Eli Abbott's cousin, as an alternative was a deliberate effort to sustain dynastic control while removing the source of conflict. Samuel was younger, more adaptable, and importantly, had no ties to the religious radicalism that marked his cousin's governance. Julia Mason began to carefully nurture this plan. Backing a change that would remove Eli Abbott while preserving family control was crucial. Military resistance to Eli Abbott was mainly focused on the Praetorian Guard, whose allegiance had been secured through lavish payments, but whose tolerance was dwindling. The emperor's disregard for military customs, his appointment of unfit favorites to leadership roles, and his clear lack of interest in military matters had alienated even those who benefited from his generosity. The conspiracy destined to end Eli Abbott's rule started to take form in early 222 AD. Key players included his own grandmother, leading senators, Praetorian commanders, and some court officials who had grown weary of the continual ceremonial demands. The scheme needed careful planning to guarantee the transfer of power would be quick and effective. The psychological condition of the emperor himself had become more and more unstable as opposition against his rule increased. Historical accounts depict moments of paranoia, fury, and erratic actions, suggesting that the burden of leadership was severely affecting him. His usual reaction to criticism was to escalate punishments and intensify religious ceremonies. Signs of an impending crisis grew throughout the winter of 221 and 222 AD. The emperor's growing alienation from traditional support networks, combined with his seeming inability to grasp the extent of dissent against his strategies, made the situation even more precarious. A situation was created where violent transformation seemed almost unavoidable. Even his closest allies began to withdraw as the political climate worsened. The actual assassination of Eli Abbott took place on the 11th of March in the year 222 during what was supposed to be an ordinary ceremony at the Praetorian camp. The emperor had arrived there accompanied by his cousin Alexander Seius to address the guards, unaware that the visit was part of an intricately planned conspiracy. Upon arrival, he faced soldiers who had already pledged allegiance to Alexander. What followed was a scene marked by chaos and cruelty. Eli Abbott tried to exert his authority, but found his usual commanding presence ineffective against troops determined to depose him. His efforts to escape proved useless because the conspirators had accounted for every possible scenario. The young emperor, who once ruled with unwavering obedience, was now powerless against the very forces that had installed him. The murder of Eli Abbott was rapid yet thorough. Accounts from the time depict how the 18-year-old ruler was struck down by many attackers, leaving no chance for survival. His mother, Julia Sloane, who had accompanied him to the camp, suffered the same fate. The dynasty's Syrian faction was wiped out within minutes. The handling of their bodies was a final rejection of all that Eli Abbott had embodied. Instead of the customary cremation and ceremony, they were discarded without honor or ceremony. The burial given to Roman emperors was brutally denied in this case, as the bodies were dragged through the streets of Rome and finally tossed into the Tiber River. Such treatment, normally reserved for ordinary criminals and traitors, sent a powerful signal about how history would view his rule. Immediately after the assassination, there was a deliberate effort to erase Eli Abbott's religious and social reforms. The sacred stone of Eli Abbott was sent back to Syria. Temples dedicated to the Eastern god were converted to honor traditional Roman deities, and the elaborate ceremonies that had dominated court life were discarded. Samuel Sears, under the influence of his mother Julia Mayers and grandmother Julia Mason, began a revival of old Roman customs. The damnatio memoriae imposed on Eli Abbott was thorough, but not complete. Although official documents were rewritten and inscriptions altered, memories of his reign survived in historical texts and public recollections. The very extremity of his reforms guaranteed that they would be remembered, even if only as warnings on how not to rule Rome. Over centuries, the judgment of Eli Abbott has changed greatly. Ancient historians such as Cassius Dio and writers of the Historia Augusta depicted him as a symbol of corruption whose reign illustrated all that was wrong with Eastern impact on Roman culture. Medieval chroniclers mostly accepted this harsh view, adding their own moral critiques regarding his private life. Modern research into religious practices has aimed to distinguish historical truth from ancient biases, acknowledging that much of what is known about Eli Abbott originates from hostile sources. Today's historians recognize that Roman writers tended to regard Eastern customs as decadent and effeminate, complicating efforts to evaluate the emperor's actual contributions without bias. The topic of Eli Abbott's gender identity has drawn significant interest among contemporary scholars. Some argue that ancient accounts depict what would now be identified as a transgender identity, potentially making Eli Abbott the earliest transgender ruler known in history. Others believe his conduct is better understood through the lens of Syrian religious traditions rather than current ideas about gender identity. Eli Abbott's religious reforms serve as an early instance of syncretic spiritual experimentation, a phenomenon that became increasingly prevalent during the later Roman Empire. His endeavor to establish a dominant solar deity prefigured certain elements of the religious changes later introduced by Constantine. Despite this, his approach and timing prevented any real success. The political implications of Eli Abbott's reign reach far beyond religious and social questions, highlighting the risks of rulers becoming estranged from the peoples they lead, regardless of other factors. No matter how absolute a ruler's authority may seem, it ultimately relies on the approval or acceptance of influential social groups. When that approval disappears, even emperors become susceptible to downfall. The involvement of Syrian women in both raising and toppling Eli Abbott highlights the intricate power relations within the Roman imperial framework. Julia Mason's choice to sacrifice her grandson in order to maintain dynastic control reveals how political strategy could surpass familial bonds. The smooth succession to Alexander Sears shows that the plot was expertly orchestrated to limit turmoil. Examining the economic and administrative side of Eli Abbott's rule sheds light on the real-world difficulties confronted by the Roman Empire during the 3rd century. His lavish expenditures and disregard for border defenses brought about challenges that troubled those who followed him. Although the empire's financial means were extensive, they were not endless, and poor fiscal management had tangible repercussions. The military aspect of his reign discloses the rising role of the army in settling imperial leadership. While traditional legal structures remained officially intact, true authority gradually shifted toward those who controlled soldiers' loyalty. Eli Abbott's failure to properly manage the military ultimately led to the collapse of his rule. The cultural ramifications of his reign went far beyond immediate political effects. The conflict between Eastern and Western customs that defined Eli Abbott's leadership mirrored broader tensions in the empire's identity and governance. Wider conflicts within the empire concerning identity and belonging continued to shape Roman society well beyond the death of the emperor. The historical evaluation of Eli Abbott brings up critical questions about how gender nonconforming and sexually diverse figures from the past have been represented. Hostile ancient sources might have exaggerated or distorted certain behaviors of the emperor to advance political messages about Eastern influence and acceptable Roman ideals. Recent archaeological discoveries from Emsa and other Syrian locations have shed new light on the religious customs Eli Abbott tried to bring into Rome. These discoveries indicate that his innovations appeared much less unusual from a Syrian viewpoint than Roman accounts claimed, pointing to authentic religious rites instead of personal deviance. The psychological aspects of Eli Abbott's story continue to intrigue both scholars and general audiences. The burden of absolute authority imposed on a young teenager, coupled with the cultural shock of relocating from Syria to Rome, created a situation that very few could successfully handle. His seeming refusal to adapt or find middle ground regarding Roman expectations may reflect not only his character traits but also deep cultural influences. Eli Abbott's modern cultural image has been profoundly influenced by the dramatic elements highlighted in ancient narratives, from Renaissance artworks to contemporary interpretations. In contemporary novels and films, he is often depicted as an emblem of excess and moral decline. These popular portrayals tend to reveal more about the cultures that produced them than about the actual emperor himself. The greater historical importance of his reign lies in what it discloses about the Roman Empire's ability to evolve and adapt. Although Eli Abbott's particular reforms were dismissed, the empire eventually experienced religious and cultural changes that were equally profound. His downfall might have stemmed more from unfortunate timing and poor execution rather than an inherent impossibility of transformation. Ultimately, Eli Abbott's narrative serves as a vivid illustration of the complexities involved in interpreting history and the perils of unchecked authority. Whether seen as a misunderstood reformer, a troubled youth, or a figure symbolizing Eastern influences, he remains among history's most compelling and debated personalities. His short rule highlighted conflicts and opportunities within Roman society that resonated long after his violent demise. The ruler who attempted to reshape Rome according to his unique vision became a cautionary example of the constraints of absolute rule and the necessity of comprehending the communities one aims to lead. His legacy still sparks discussion and contemplation about power, identity, faith, and the essence of governance. By trying to reshape Rome according to his own vision, Eli Abbott instead brought about his own downfall and left behind a historical enigma that still puzzles researchers and fascinates minds more than 18 centuries after his time.